Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany, New York. My name is Michael Hornsby and I am the service associate today. This morning, we welcome to our pulpit the Reverend Dr. Chris Antal, who is Chief Clinical Staff Chaplain at the Michael J. Crescenz VA Medical Center in Philadelphia. He is also a former Army chaplain and a veteran of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. While deployed in 2012, he established a Unitarian congregation at Kandahar Airfield, where he preached a sermon the Army determined was politically inflammatory, and the Army responded with an official reprimand and release from active duty. His public resignation of his officer commission in 2016 was a protest reported in media outlets around the world. He is a pioneer in addressing military moral injury and has published about his work in several peer-reviewed journals. And this is a homecoming of sorts for Reverend Antal, as he interned here at Albany UU from 2009 through 2010, and he was ordained by our congregation in 2011. I am honored to welcome Reverend Antal back to our pulpit this morning. Okay, so the call to celebration is a poem by Charles Bukowski entitled Bluebird. One moment. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke, and the women and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? Do you want to screw up the works? Do you want to blow my book sales in Europe? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night, sometimes when everybody's asleep. I say, I know that you're there, so don't be sad. And then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die, and we sleep together like that with our secret pact, and it's nice enough to make a man weep. But I don't weep, do you? Okay, and now we will have the prelude. Oh, okay. Thank you, Anne. Okay, so please join me in the chalice lighting, words shown on the screen. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community. Okay, next we will sing a unison song. The words will appear on the screen. Please join me in singing The Leaf Unfurling, written by John Corrado. Excuse me, there we are. I should mention that if you see my hands shaking, it's not because I'm nervous. I don't get nervous about these things. It's just Parkinson's disease. It's only Parkinson's disease, so don't be concerned. We welcome our viewers from Facebook who will be joining us now for our service. My name is Michael Hornsby, and I'm the service associate today. Welcome to our pulpit, the Reverend Dr. Chris Antal, who is clinical staff chaplain at the Michael J. Crescenz VA Medical Center in Philadelphia. and he is a former intern here at First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany, New York, and he was ordained in our congregation back in 2011. Okay, Chris?
This is a reading from a German theologian. His name is Geico Müller-Fahrenholz, who wrote a book called The Art of Forgiveness, and his own work of moral reckoning with his contribution as a German citizen to the Holocaust. And it's an excerpt on what he calls deep remembering. Selective remembering is a way of rereading history that looks at national victories without counting the damage done to others. That is, without contemplating the guilt involved. Deep remembering, on the contrary, is grateful for genuine greatness, but it does not shun guilt and suppression. It rejoices in human inventiveness and ingenuity, but it also shares in the many forms of suffering. Deep remembering is about transforming the art of the possible.
Today's spoken meditation will be a poem by Alfred Noyes, written in 1916 during that little conflagration called World War I, which was the war to end all wars. This poem was written, the second part of it was written from the viewpoint of the dead, the soldiers who died on the battlefields. The title of the poem is On the Western Front. I found a dreadful acre of the dead, marked with the only sign the earth that saves. The wings of death were hurrying overhead. The loose earth shook on those unquiet graves. For the deep gun pits with the quick stabs of flame made their own thunders of the sunlit air. Yet, as I read the crosses, name by name, rank after rank, it seemed that peace was there. Sunlight and peace, a peace too deep for thought, the peace of tides that underlie our strife, the peace with which the moving heavens are fraught, the peace that is our everlasting life. The loose earth shook, the very hills were stirred, the silence of the dead was all I heard. We who lie here have nothing more to pray. To all your praises we are deaf and blind. We may not ever know if you betray our hope to make earth better for mankind. Only our silence in the night shall grow more silent as the stars grow in the sky. And while you deck our graves, you shall not know how many scornful legions pass you by. For we have heard you say, when we were living, that some small dream of good would cost too much. But when the foe struck, we have watched you giving and seen you move the mountains with one touch. What can be done we know, but have no fear. If you fail now, we shall not see or hear. We will now enter a time of silent meditation.
This is one of those messages I feel in my gut and throughout my body, and it kind of has to work its way up into words. So I'm inviting us to do the work of remembrance and mourning. Remembrance and mourning is part of a larger process of trauma and recovery, articulated by Judith Herman in a book by that name. It involves safety, establishing safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. And Herman argues, and I believe this to be true, that this path, and it's not linear, it's cyclical, is the path to recover from trauma, and not just survive, but to thrive and to flourish. And so we're here to nurture each other and thrive and flourish, and that's the end goal, and it's important to keep that end goal in sight because the work of remembrance and mourning is not easy. And in the midst of it, we may wonder, why are we suffering like this? Trauma. Thank you, Jay, for defining it well for me this morning, quoting Dr. Russell Vanderkolk, happens when our internal resources and our external supports are overwhelmed. Learning how to navigate trauma is integral to human flourishing. We live in a moment of what I would call cascading, accumulating traumas. And there are many places we can be stuck in the process of path to flourishing. And this morning I'll focus on this work of remembrance and mourning. It's a stuck point often because we don't remember well, and we also don't mourn well. And in response to the bluebird, I weep. Part of my practice is to cry, is to release that bluebird and to facilitate the release of that bluebird in others. And if your bluebird needs to be let out this morning, then I give you permission to let it fly. For weeping is a part of mourning. To do this work, we need to care for ourselves. We need to build our capacities and reach out to communal supports. In this community, we have pastoral care associates. We have people experienced in trauma, like Jay. We have a minister, Sam Trumborn. I find it helpful to move and to breathe and to drink water. So I want to give you permission during our time together to care for yourself, and after our time together to reach out to the resources that are here. I've asked Ann if we could do a couple rounds of Rise Up, O Flame. It's not going to appear on your screen, but it's a very simple round, and it can help us breathe. It's 362 if you want to read it, but I'll teach it to you. It's a very simple round, but as we do this together, as we imagine our chalice, I invite us to practice just breathing deeply through this words. show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Let's try it together. Rise up, O flame, by the light glowing. Show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Breathe in again. Rise up, O flame, by the light glowing. Show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Feel free to rise up, breathe. Rise up, O flame, by the light glowing. Show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Flames show us beauty, vision, and joy. Flames also consume, destroy, incinerate, and char. Let's remember that. I remember the lunchbox and the superfortress. The charred metal lunchbox has a decorative bamboo pattern and contains a small amount of rice mixed with chopped white radish and some boiled beans. That lunch, as of yesterday, was 77 years old. On the morning of August 6, 1945, 12-year-old Rieko Watanabe set off to work on the government-ordered demolition of buildings to create fire breaks in the case of air raids, a job they had begun the day before. She carried this lunch that her mother had made for her. Reiko was a first-year student at Hiroshima First Municipal Girls' School. That morning, Reiko tried to get out of going to work, said her younger sister, Naoko. But Mom scolded her and sent her on her way with a special treat. By that time in the war, white rice was a luxury. Reiko's mother had prepared this meal as a special treat for her daughter. The students gathered along the south side of the earthen wall of a local temple for their morning assembly. They were told to leave their belongings, their water bottles, lunch boxes, and the like by the wall, and they started to work. Minutes later, the flight crew, piloted by U.S. Army Air Force service members, soared overhead in their B-29 Superfortress, the Enola Gay, and released an atomic bomb, the first of two that would ever be deployed on human targets. The bomb exploded at 8:15 in the morning, and all 541 students were killed. Reiko's lunchbox was found the following day, about 540 meters from the epicenter of the blast, by her elder sister, Keiko. I had etched her name into the bottom of the aluminum lunchbox with a needle, so I knew it was hers, she said. Their father, Shigeru, who was working at the post office in Okayama, returned to Hiroshima to look for Rieko, but her remains, if they existed at all, were never found. Her parents held on to Rieko's lunchbox for 25 years. Then they donated it to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in 1970, where it was held for another 25 years. And in 1995, maybe that was 85, the curators of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum drafted plans for the commemorative exhibit in Washington, D.C. Reiko's lunchbox found its way into the consciousness of the curators as one of the artifacts from Ground Zero that would be in the display together with the Enola Gay, the superfortress, an emblem of triumph, and the lunchbox, an emblem of tragedy. For a brief moment in time, it seemed that these two emblems would sit together in the same space, challenging all who came into their presence to deep remembering. Sadly, that would never be. The lunchbox was one of the items singled out for criticism and was eventually censored from the Enola Gay exhibit. The US Congress, in rejecting the draft exhibition, called the atomic bombing a merciful end to the war, and somehow the display of that lunchbox didn't fit with that narrative. The head curator resigned, the exhibition was canceled, and all that was displayed was the superfortress with a life-size wall poster of the crew of the Enola Gay, 11 white men, all appearing happy and relaxed. In the book History Wars, the Enola Gay and Other Battles for the American Past, historian John Dower writes this: "The linkage of veneration for cataclysmic weapons of destruction and psychic denial of what they destroyed is a subject fit for students of social and cultural pathologies." What has become of our social and cultural pathologies of psychic denial? George W. Bush, speaking on May 18th at his own presidential center in Dallas, the Southern Methodist University, gives us a clue. I quote his words: "The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq." He said that, intending to condemn Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. He confessed the truth. He launched a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. It was a moment of deep remembering. It ought to have been a moment of weeping, collective weeping. But the pathologies kicked in. George W. Bush dismissed it with a chuckle. The audience laughed. Ahmed Twaji, a child of Iraqi migrants, wrote this the following day. He said, "The unbelievable sniggering, distasteful, by the man who launched a war resulting in at least 800,000 estimated Iraqi deaths and the displacement of 1 million more, is nothing short of despicable." I remember 2 decades ago, just 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, granting the executive branch expansive authority to use, quote unquote, all necessary and appropriate force anywhere on earth, forever. The vote was unanimous in the Senate, and in the House, only Barbara Lee dissented saying, "Let us not become the evil we deplore." Citizens, with few exceptions, granted moral license. Who has paid attention to what we have done in the 2 decades since we, the people, authorized military force? Who knows where we have used military force? Do you? Who knows how many countries? Can you name them? Who knows how many bombs we have dropped? Do you have a clue? 46 a day, every day for 20 years. About 340,000 bombs, according to the Air Force's own public record. Who knows how much money the United States has spent, or which corporations and individuals have profited the most? Military force is ultimately about violence, about killing. What do you know about our violence? What do you know about our killing? How many service members have been killed in combat operations? Do you know? How many other people have been killed? How many veterans have killed themselves? Can you name a single person right now who has been killed in warfare in the past 20 years? If you can't, I ask you to consider, what does that mean? The intentional harm of war is not limited to killing. How many people have been wounded, displaced, tortured, imprisoned? How many families have been terrorized, living under the perpetual stare of US drones hovering over homes and villages, waiting to unleash death by hellfire? Most veterans I encounter have the names of war dead etched into their hearts. Some wear these names engraved into metal bands around their wrists, stitched into their jackets, or tattooed on their flesh. Others are haunted by the sights, smells, and sounds of the people whose death they helped cause and whose names we will never know. Yet most citizens I meet cannot name a single person who has been killed or injured because of our use of military force over the past 20 years. To achieve what I call moral health, mental health based on moral integrity, to achieve thriving, flourishing, our society, our communities, us, we need to do the work of moral reckoning, which includes the work of deep remembrance, and mourning, by asking these questions. But not stop there. We then need to ask this question: has the military force we the people authorized 20 years ago and executed around the world for 20 years been necessary? Has it been appropriate? I know something about the consequences of our use of military force from my experience as a chaplain, first in the Army and now in the VA. In Afghanistan, I supported 29 transfer ceremonies of dead young people. Among them, Brittany Gordon, blown up by a uniformed member of the Afghan intelligence service in an insider attack, and Joe Price, a Navy SEAL who shot himself just days after we stood together on the flight line on 3 separate occasions and saluted the caskets of men who had died under his command. I regret not reaching out to Job when I had the chance. I reached out to David Lynch while he was still alive. I visited him in prison after he returned from Iraq and murdered his girlfriend, Althea Lewis. Corey Hadley and I were in Afghanistan at the same time. He came to me for help and later killed himself. I regret not doing more. I attended his funeral in a Philadelphia church where I heard his grandmother scream his name, "Corey!" as the lid to his coffin came down. I'll never forget that scream. I've heard the silence of the dead, and I've also heard the screams of anguish of the living. Without awareness of the costs of our wars, how can we arrive at moral judgment? How can we know whether we have used necessary and appropriate military force or we have become the evil that we deplore? How can we know if we should respond with gratitude and pride or guilt and disgust? If we should say, "Thank you for your service," or "I'm sorry, we told you to go there and do that"? Indeed, we shut guilt out at our peril. Without guilt, we welcome instead sociopathy, the kind of pathology that unfolded at Southern Methodist University and the Smithsonian. The experience of guilt delivers us from sociopathy, and it may very well deliver us from evil as well. These days, I do work with moral injury. Moral injury seems to be a more clinically and culturally acceptable way to talk about the consequences of sin and the presence of evil in our lives. The hope for healing our moral injury is, in part, the work of deep remembering and mourning, not individually in isolation, but collectively in community. These days, I lead a 12-week moral injury group in Philadelphia with a staff psychologist. And in the 10th week, we hold a community healing ceremony. The ceremony presents an opportunity for our veterans to give testimony, to educate the community about the real human costs of our military engagements. Communal confession is an integral part of that ceremony, and it's the path towards relieving the weight, the moral weight, that is unfairly weighing on our veteran community. Through communal confession, the community shares responsibility. Veterans find relief, and authentic homecoming is a result. One obvious obstacle to an honest moral reckoning is that so much remains unknown. Sometimes our ignorance is willful. We choose not to know because we want to avoid the anxiety of having to face painful truths and reckon with what those truths ask of us. And sometimes we've earnestly sought to know, only to be blocked by secrecy, misinformation, even deception. For most of us, we are far removed from direct violence, and we enjoy the privilege of proximity. Privilege means we have a choice. We can pay attention to the consequences of our use of military force, or we can ignore those consequences. I'm suggesting that flourishing, thriving, recovery from trauma is not achieved through avoidance or denial, but through deep remembering, mourning, awareness. Fortunately for those who choose to pay attention, there are great resources, and this is where I find hope, and I'll end with hope. The Costs of War Project at Brown University, for those with the will to know, will inform you about the costs of our wars with evidence-based research. The journalism of Azmat Khan, New York Times journalist who has been on the ground reporting on the consequences of US airstrikes. The testimonies of veterans themselves, including our own community healing ceremony, which has gone hybrid and in which you can all participate. The next one is December 8th from 4 to 6 p.m. And I'll make sure that the link goes out in your newsletter. For me, part of my own self-care as I work with trauma and stay in a place of thriving is movement. Movement is medicine. I stay active. I also connect with organizations that are addressing root causes and working towards making amends. I'm going to name 3 organizations, and the honorarium I receive from this community for my sermon today will be split as a donation to these 3 organizations. And I encourage each one of you to consider matching that. I'll give each one $120. The first organization is the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Andrew Basevich is a military historian, retired colonel. His son died in Iraq, prolific author, and the founder of this institute. They're pointing a new path for our nation that I believe is hopeful. The second is the Arms Control Association. The tragedy and atrocity of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has not been repeated in 77 years. And the large credit goes to the work of the arms control movement. Michael Crapan, author of this new book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control, reminds us of the imperative in this moment. He says, the practice of arms control has limited and reduced the most powerful weapons ever devised. Yet there are now 4 nuclear-armed rivalries. Nuclear danger is rising on all 4 fronts: the United States and Russia, the United States and China, China and India and Pakistan. Guardrails and stabilization measures are lacking, and their absence invites crisis. That's why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says we're how close to midnight? Less than 2 minutes, 30 seconds maybe. 30 seconds. The closest we've been since they started reporting in 1947. So the arms control movement is a place for us to invest our time and energy and resources. The norm of no battlefield use, the norm of no testing of nuclear weapons, the norm of non-proliferation came out of people who organized, who connected around arms control. Capone says, every day that passes without use and testing strengthens these norms. Success happens one day at a time. And finally, the third organization is the Kim Foundation. Phan Thai Kim Phuc, also known as the Napalm Girl, was burned, scalded by US napalm on June 8th, 1972. The image of her running down a road screaming is iconic. This year commemorates 50 years of that. Phan Thai Kim Phuc has a foundation called the Kim Foundation, and she has a book she's published in which she tells her story. It's called The Fire Road, the Napalm Girl's journey through the horrors of war to faith, forgiveness, and peace. Malika and Samaya, 2-year-old girls killed in the final drone strike of the Afghan war among the 10, incinerated by hellfire on August 29th last summer. Reiko Watanabe, the 12-year-old, incinerated by an atomic bomb. Their lives ended. Phan Thai Kim Phuc has lived on, and she's shown us a great model of faith, forgiveness, recovery, and hope.
An important way we celebrate life each Sunday is by offering an opportunity to practice generosity. Members and friends support our congregation with an annual pledge paid throughout the year. Another way to support the good work of this congregation is by making a generous contribution as we pass the plate, or via one of the options shown on the next slide. The next slide, okay. If you are joining us virtually, you can click on the tiny URL link in the chat window to contribute, or you can send a text to the number shown on the screen. The examples on the slide show how to label your text to indicate the amount and purpose of your gift. We must now say goodbye to our Facebook friends. Consider joining us on Zoom next time, or visit us at 405 Washington Avenue, Albany, New York. You can find more information at albanyuu.org. The offertory music, our offertory music is the Ashokan Farewell. We enjoy welcoming guests and visitors to our service. If you'd like to tell us who you are and where you're from, those in community halls should stand or raise your hand. The usher will bring you a microphone. Okay, that would be Kathy Harris. So that everyone can hear you. Those joining us on Zoom can click on the raise hand symbol found under the reactions button on your Zoom toolbar. Our technician will invite you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. You may also, or instead, click on the visitor link you'll find now in the chat window. Okay, so today we will have a poem of affirmation rather than a prayer. Today's poem is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And next we'll sing a unison song. The words will appear on the screen. Please join in singing We'll Build a Land by Carolyn McDade.
Alice? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Remember and mourn well. Remember that to do that well, we need safety. We need to find our sanctuary, safe relationships. To do that well, we need to connect. We need to reconnect. Remembering and mourning well cannot be done in isolation. Release the bluebird. Weep when your heart moves you to weep. Remember that no one can know what the next hour will bring. So here we are, we laugh, we cry, we mourn, we sing.
Our thanks to Ann Brandon, who was our musician today, Kathy Harris, Kristen Abbas, and Jean Poppy, who are our ushers. The pastoral care associate was Annie Lipinski, is Annie Lipinski. The service associate is yours truly. The welcomers were Amy Lind, Barb Manning, the greeters Jay Holly. Office support from Tammy Goddard and Patience Pichette. Technical support from Chris Jensen and Peter Meixner.